Imagine 14th century Europe. Castles stand atop hills, torches blaze in stone halls, and it seems as though the world will remain this way forever. But everything changes in an instant. One crown is left without an heir, and immediately, two kings claim it as their own. Thus begins a story that will unfold over nearly a century. A story where not only the sword decides the outcome, but also blood, disease, and faith. England and France, two powers bound by kinship, become enemies. Battles that alter the course of history. A plague that claims millions of lives. And a girl who defies fate. In this video, we'll calmly and systematically break down how the 100 Years' War began, why it lasted so long, and how a new Europe was born in the struggle for the crown. If you enjoy stories like this, deep, atmospheric ones you can listen to before bed, subscribe to the channel and support this video with a like. And now, let's transport ourselves to a world where the crown was worth a whole century of war. To understand why two kingdoms spent centuries tearing each other apart, you have to understand something about the medieval mind that is genuinely difficult for a modern person to grasp. In the 14th century, a royal bloodline was not merely a political convenience. It was understood by almost everyone who mattered, by kings and nobles, by bishops and peasants, by the chroniclers who recorded events, and the priests who interpreted them as a kind of sacred trust. The right to rule was not earned through competence or popular support. It was inherited, transmitted through blood, and sanctioned by God. A legitimate king was not simply a powerful man who happened to sit on a throne. He was the anointed representative of divine authority on earth, the living link in an unbroken chain that connected the present moment to the ancient foundations of the kingdom itself. This is why the question of succession was never merely administrative. It was theological, existential, and, when the answer was genuinely unclear, extraordinarily dangerous. In 1328, the answer to the succession question in France became genuinely unclear. Charles IV, the last of the direct Capetian line that had ruled France without interruption for over 3 centuries, died in February of that year. He left behind a pregnant wife, and the court held its breath. If the child was a boy, the crisis would be averted. When the queen gave birth to a daughter, the crisis became unavoidable. France had no king, no male heir, and a throne that every powerful man with even a distant claim to royal blood was suddenly and urgently interested in. The Capetian dynasty had produced kings of France since 987. Its unbroken succession was a source of immense institutional stability and deep emotional significance for the kingdom's identity. Now the chain had snapped, and the question of who would pick up the crown was not going to be resolved quietly. The French nobility moved quickly and with a clear preference. They supported Philip of Valois, Philip VI as he would become, the cousin of the dead king and the nearest male relative through the male line. His claim rested on what would later be formalized as Salic law, the principle that succession to the French throne passed exclusively through man and could not be transmitted through female lineage. Under this interpretation, Philip's blood relationship to the Capetian line through his father made him the legitimate heir, regardless of any competing claims that might be advanced through female descent. The competing claim came from across the English Channel. Edward III of England was 17 years old in 1328, recently crowned, and possessed of a genealogical argument that was, depending on how you read the rules, either entirely compelling or completely inadmissible. His mother was Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV, which made Edward the grandson of a French king through the direct line. By the strict logic of blood proximity, his connection to the Capetian dynasty was closer than Philip of Valois'. Edward was not a distant cousin. He was a direct descendant of the royal house whose throne was now vacant. The problem, under the French nobility's interpretation of succession law, was precisely that his connection ran through his mother. Isabella was a woman. The crown, under Salic law, couldn't pass through a woman, and therefore couldn't pass to a son by virtue of his mother's lineage. Edward's claim, however genealogically compelling it might appear, was constitutionally inadmissible in the eyes of the French court. Edward, predictably, disagreed. He did not immediately push his disagreement to the point of war. In 1328, he was young. His own position in England was not yet fully secure, and the practical difficulties of pressing a claim to the French throne against the combined opposition of the French nobility were formidable. He even performed homage to Philip VI for his French territorial holdings, the Duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France, which English kings had held since the marriage of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 12th century. This act of homage was interpreted by the French court as an implicit recognition of Philip's legitimacy. Edward interpreted it differently. He would later argue that performing homage for a duchy was not the same as conceding a claim to a kingdom. The distinction mattered because the relationship between the English crown and its French territorial holdings was itself a source of chronic tension that predated the succession crisis and would have generated conflict even without it. Aquitaine, sometimes called Gascony, was a wealthy, strategically important territory whose exact political status had been disputed for generations. Was it a fully sovereign possession of the English crown, or a fief held in subordination to the French king? The feudal law of the period provided no clean answer, and both sides interpreted the ambiguity in whichever direction suited their immediate interests. Philip VI, consolidating his new authority, pushed the interpretation that maximized French royal power. He demanded that Edward perform full liege homage, a more complete and unconditional form of feudal submission than Edward was willing to offer. He interfered in the governance of Aquitaine in ways that Edward experienced as encroachments on his sovereignty. He supported Scottish resistance to English authority, providing a sanctuary and a source of diplomatic support for England's northern enemies at moments calculated to cause maximum inconvenience. Each of these actions was, in isolation, defensible within the conventions of medieval feudal politics. Taken together, they formed a pattern of pressure that was either a legitimate exercise of French royal prerogative or a sustained campaign of harassment, depending on which side of the channel you stood on. Edward responded by doing something that transformed the dispute from a feudal quarrel into something much larger. In 1337, he formally reasserted his claim to the French throne. The declaration was not simply a legal argument, it was a statement of identity, of legitimacy and of intent. By claiming the French crown, Edward was not merely demanding a piece of territory or a resolution of a feudal grievance. He was asserting that Philip VI was not the rightful king of France, that the man currently sitting on the French throne was a usurper, that his government lacked divine sanction, and that the kingdom's true sovereign was an English king whose right had been wrongfully denied. Philip's response was equally unambiguous. He declared Edward's French territories forfeit and began moving to take military possession of them. The machinery of war, once set in motion, developed its own momentum. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the sheer improbability of what was beginning. Two of the most powerful kingdoms in Christian Europe were preparing to fight a war whose stated cause was a question of inheritance law, a dispute about which interpretation of feudal succession rules correctly identified the legitimate heir to a throne that had fallen vacant 9 years earlier. The men who would die in this conflict, the villages that would be burned, the harvests that would be destroyed, the plague of military devastation that would roll across the French countryside for generations. All of it would flow from a disagreement that was, at its core, about genealogy and legal interpretation. But to describe it that way is to miss what was actually at stake. The crown of France in 1337 was not merely a piece of jewelry. It represented sovereignty over the largest, wealthiest, and most populous kingdom in Western Europe. It meant control of agricultural land, trade routes, tax revenues, and military resources on a scale that would decisively shape the balance of power on the continent for centuries. It meant the difference between being the dominant power in European politics and being a secondary one. For Edward III, the claim to France was not an abstraction. It was the difference between a kingdom and an empire. For Philip VI, the defense of his throne was not a legal technicality. It was the survival of everything he had built and everything he was. Between those two imperatives, there was no room for compromise. There was only war. War in the 14th century was not the industrialized, total conflict that the modern world would come to know 6 centuries later. It was, in its own way, a highly ritualized activity, governed by codes of chivalry, constrained by the practical limits of medieval logistics, and shaped by a set of shared assumptions about how armed conflict between Christian kingdoms ought to be conducted. Knights were ransomed rather than killed when possible, because a living prisoner was worth money and a dead one was worth nothing. Civilians were, in theory at least, protected by the conventions of just war as interpreted by the Church. Sieges followed recognizable patterns. Pitched battles were relatively rare, and the campaign season was largely dictated by the agricultural calendar, since armies needed to feed themselves from the land they moved through, and winter made sustained operations nearly impossible. These conventions did not make medieval warfare humane. They made it, in certain specific ways, predictable, and predictability, in a world without the communications infrastructure or administrative capacity to sustain truly unlimited conflict, was what kept wars from consuming everything. What the 100 Years' War would do over its long and grinding course was stress those conventions to the breaking point and, in several critical respects, shatter them entirely. The conflict that began in 1337 would not simply be a larger version of the dynastic wars that had preceded it. It would be a laboratory for new forms of violence, new military technologies, and new relationships between armies and the civilian populations they moved through. Relationships that would leave marks on the French countryside and the French national consciousness that lasted for generations. The opening phase of the war established several patterns that would persist in varied forms for decades. Edward III was capable and energetic military commander, and he understood from the beginning that the strategic problem he faced was formidable. France was larger, wealthier, and more populous than England. Its king could, in principle, field armies that dwarfed anything Edward could muster from his own resources. To compensate for this structural disadvantage, Edward pursued a strategy that combined alliance building with a particular form of aggressive raiding known as the chevauchée. The chevauchée was not a battle. It was, in modern terms, closer to a terror campaign. An English army would ride rapidly through a region of France, burning villages, destroying crops, slaughtering livestock, and carrying off anything of portable value. The immediate military purpose was to deny resources to the French crown and demonstrate that Philip VI could not protect his own subjects, a devastating blow to royal prestige in a political culture where the king's ability to provide security for his people was one of the primary justifications for his authority. The secondary purpose was economic. The plunder generated by a successful chevauchée helped finance further operations and rewarded the men who conducted them. The human cost of this strategy fell almost entirely on the peasants and townspeople of the affected regions, who bore no personal responsibility for the dynastic dispute that had brought foreign soldiers to their fields and homes. This was not an unintended side effect that troubled medieval commanders greatly. It was, in a meaningful sense, the point. Alliance building took Edward to the Low Countries, where he cultivated relationships with the princes and city-states of what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, territories that had their own complicated relationships with French royal authority and their own economic reasons to prefer English commercial connections. These alliances were expensive to maintain and often unreliable, but they gave Edward diplomatic leverage and occasionally military support that extended his strategic reach. The first major naval engagement of the war came in 1340 at the Battle of Sluis, fought in the waters of the Flemish coast. The French had assembled a large fleet intended to threaten England with invasion and disrupt English supply lines to the continent. Edward's fleet attacked and, in a battle that lasted most of a day, effectively destroyed the French naval force. Contemporary accounts describe the sea turning red with blood and the surface of the water so choked with French dead that it was said, if fish could speak, they would have spoken French. The victory at Sluis gave England control of the English Channel for a generation and secured the sea lanes that made sustained operations in France possible. It did not, however, resolve the fundamental strategic problem. France remained large, France remained wealthy, and the French crown remained capable of fielding armies that could contest English advances on land. The land battle that would most dramatically illustrate both England's military strengths and France's vulnerabilities came 6 years later, in August 1346 on a gentle hillside near a village called Crécy in northern France. Philip VI had assembled a substantial army. Estimates vary, but it was certainly large, and it included the flower of French chivalry, the heavily armored mounted knights, who represented both the military elite and the social ideal of medieval aristocratic culture. Edward's army was smaller, but had spent weeks on campaign and had developed the cohesion and discipline that comes from shared hardship. More importantly, it was built around a weapon that the French would find, to their catastrophic surprise, they had no adequate answer for. The English longbow was not a new invention in 1346. It had been used by Welsh archers for generations and had been a significant component of English armies since Edward I's campaigns in Wales and Scotland. But its systematic deployment as the primary offensive instrument of a major field army, supported by dismounted knights and men-at-arms fighting defensively, represented a genuine tactical innovation whose implications French commanders had not fully absorbed. A trained English longbowman could loose between 10 and 12 arrows per minute, with an effective range of up to 250 yards. An army of several thousand such archers, positioned on favorable ground and disciplined enough to release volleys on command, could put tens of thousands of arrows into the air every minute. Against unarmored infantry, this was simply devastating. Against armored cavalry, it was more complicated. A direct hit on plate armor at long range might not penetrate, but it killed and wounded horses. It struck visors and joints and gaps in armor, and above all it created chaos. Horses screaming and rearing, riders thrown, formations broken. The carefully maintained momentum of a cavalry charge dissipated in a storm of falling shafts before the knights ever reached the English line. The French cavalry charged the English position at Crécy repeatedly, with extraordinary courage and almost no tactical effect. Each charge broke against the arrow storm and the steady English line. The Genoese crossbowmen, whom Philip had hired as mercenaries, were outranged by the longbows and driven from the field early in the engagement. By the time darkness ended the fighting, the French army had been wrecked. The dead included the King of Bohemia, the Count of Flanders, and somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 French knights and nobles. The social and military leadership of a kingdom destroyed in an afternoon. Edward followed Crécy with the siege and capture of Calais, which would remain an English possession for over 2 centuries and serve as the essential bridgehead for English operations in France. The strategic and psychological impact of these twin blows, a catastrophic field defeat followed by the loss of a major port, was profound. But Philip VI was not destroyed. France was not conquered. The war had barely begun. What Crécy demonstrated with brutal clarity was that the military assumptions on which French strategy had been built were no longer reliable. The age of the mounted knight as a decisive instrument of battle, the age that had shaped European warfare for 3 centuries, was ending. What would replace it was not yet entirely clear, but the arrows falling like rain on that August afternoon had already written the first sentence of the answer. In the late summer of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina after a long voyage to the Black Sea. The port authorities who came to meet them made a discovery that would, in the months and years that followed, prove to be one of the most consequential encounters in human history. Most of the sailors aboard the ships were dead. Those who were still alive were gravely ill, covered in strange black swellings that oozed blood and pus, racked with fever, delirious, and dying. The ships were ordered out of the harbor immediately. It was already too late. What those ships carried was Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, a disease that had been moving westward along the trade routes from Central Asia for several years, leaving devastation in its wake across the Middle East and the Byzantine Empire before it reached the Mediterranean ports of Europe. From Sicily, it spread to the Italian mainland, then to France, then to the Iberian Peninsula, then northward to the Low Countries, and into England and Scandinavia. It moved along roads and rivers and coastlines, following the arteries of medieval commerce with a terrible fidelity, reaching into cities and villages and monasteries and castles with an indifference to rank, wealth, nationality, or piety that contemporaries found as theologically disturbing as it was physically terrifying. The medieval world had experienced epidemics before. Plague itself was not entirely unknown. There had been a major pandemic in the 6th century, the so-called Plague of Justinian, which had devastated the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean world. But the generations alive in 1347 had no living memory of anything on this scale, and the explanatory frameworks available to them, theological, astrological, medical, were wholly inadequate to account for what they were witnessing. Physicians trained in the Galenic tradition understood disease as an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors, to be treated with bloodletting, purging, and adjustments to diet and environment. This framework, whatever its merits in other contexts, had nothing useful to offer against a bacterial infection transmitted by fleas carried by rats. The treatments recommended by the most learned doctors of the period were not merely useless. Some of them, by encouraging people to gather together and by weakening already compromised immune systems, may have actively accelerated transmission. The Church offered spiritual explanations and spiritual remedies. The plague was God's punishment for human sin, a judgment, a warning, an opportunity for repentance and reform. Flagellant movements arose across Europe. Groups of men who traveled from town to town, publicly beating themselves with leather straps and iron-tipped whips in acts of collective penance, intended to appease divine wrath. These processions attracted enormous crowds, and almost certainly helped spread the disease to communities that might otherwise have been spared. Jewish communities were blamed in many parts of Europe, and subjected to massacres of appalling brutality, a phenomenon whose irrationality was not diminished by its terrible consistency across different regions and cultures. None of it worked, because none of it engaged with the actual mechanism of transmission. The mortality figures, reconstructed by historians from parish records, tax rolls, wills, and chronicles, are staggering even by the standards of a century that had already seen considerable violence. Estimates for Europe as a whole range from 30 to 60% of the total population dead within the space of roughly 5 years. Some regions fared better, others fared catastrophically worse. Florence lost perhaps half its population. Hamburg and Bremen lost roughly 2/3. Certain villages in France and England were simply emptied, the survivors abandoning the dead, the dying, and moving on, leaving settlements that would remain uninhabited for decades. For the Hundred Years' War, the arrival of the plague produced an effect that no military campaign, however successful, could have achieved. It stopped the fighting, not through negotiation or exhaustion, but through the simple and terrible fact that armies require living men, and living men were becoming scarce. Edward III's campaigns in France were suspended. The siege operations that English forces had been conducting, the chevauchées that had been burning their way through French territory, the diplomatic maneuvering that had been consuming the energy of both courts, all of it slowed and in many respects halted entirely. Not because either king decided to make peace, but because the administrative and military infrastructure that sustained warfare simply could not function when the people who composed it were dying in extraordinary numbers. The logistical demands of a medieval army were, by modern standards, relatively modest, but they were still demands for food, for horses, for equipment, for the craftsmen who made and maintained weapons, for the administrators who managed supply chains, for the peasants whose agricultural labor produced the surpluses that everything else depended on. When those populations were devastated, the surplus disappeared, the supply chains broke down, and the capacity to sustain military operations collapsed with them. There was also a more immediate and a personal dimension. Edward III lost his daughter Joan to the plague in 1348 as she was traveling through France on her way to marry the heir to the Castilian throne. Philip VI lost his queen. Nobles, knights, bishops, administrators, the people whose personal relationships and institutional roles held the machinery of medieval governance together, died in numbers that left both kingdoms struggling to function at the most basic level. The truce that had already been arranged between England and France in 1347, before the plague arrived in full force, was extended repeatedly, not because the underlying dispute had been resolved, but because neither side had the capacity to resume serious operations. The war did not end. It hibernated. But while it hibernated, the plague was doing something to European society that would ultimately affect the character of the conflict when it resumed. It was, with grotesque efficiency, so restructuring the social and economic order that the war had been fighting over. The most fundamental change was demographic, and its consequences were economic. Feudal agriculture in the 14th century operated on the assumption of abundant, cheap labor. A large peasant population bound to the land by ties of legal obligation and economic necessity, farming the estates of lords who extracted rents and services in exchange for protection. When a third to a half of that labor force died within a few years, the relationship between lords and peasants changed in ways that no law or tradition could prevent. Surviving peasants found, for the first time in generations, that their labor was scarce and therefore valuable. They could demand better terms. They could move to estates where lords offered more favorable conditions. They could in some cases simply refuse to work under the old arrangements and find that their lords, desperate for labor, had little practical recourse. The rigid hierarchies of feudal society, which had seemed as permanent and natural as the seasons, began to show cracks. This did not happen overnight. The ruling classes fought back, through legislation, through violence, through determined efforts to reassert the old order. England's Statute of Labours, passed in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent peasants from seeking better conditions elsewhere. France enacted similar measures. Neither worked particularly well, because economic reality has a way of overcoming legal prohibition when the underlying conditions have fundamentally changed. What the plague had done, in other words, was introduce into the middle of a dynastic war about crowns and inheritance a separate and deeper transformation about the nature of society itself, about who owned labor, who controlled land, and what obligations bound one class to another. The kings who would resume the war in the plague's aftermath would be fighting over a France that was no longer quite the France the war had begun over. The world the plague left behind was quieter, emptier, and strange, and into that strangeness the war would return. By the opening decades of the 15th century, France was a kingdom that had forgotten what winning felt like. The decades following the plague had brought no resolution to the dynastic conflict, only a grinding continuation of it, punctuated by truces that neither side honored with conviction, by internal French political struggles that weakened the kingdom's ability to resist English pressure, and by a series of military disasters that had progressively eroded French confidence in its own capacity to defend itself. The chevauchés had continued, burning their way through provinces that were still recovering from the demographic catastrophe of the Black Death. The taxation required to fund resistance had impoverished communities already struggling to rebuild. Peasant uprisings, the Jacquerie of 1358 being the most violent and the most brutally suppressed, had revealed the depths of social fractures that the plague had opened and the war had widened. And then came Agincourt. In October 1415, Henry V of England led an exhausted, disease-weakened army of perhaps 6,000 men across a muddy field in northern France, and destroyed a French force that outnumbered it by a ratio that contemporary chronicles placed as high as 5 or 6 to 1. The precise numbers are disputed by modern historians, but the outcome is not. The French army, packed too tightly to maneuver effectively, advancing across waterlogged ground toward the English archers who had learned nothing, or rather, had forgotten nothing, from Crécy and Poitiers, was slaughtered with a thoroughness that shocked even a Europe accustomed to the violence of prolonged war. Agincourt did not merely damage France militarily, it devastated France psychologically. The flower of French chivalry had died in the mud of a field in Picardy, and the explanation that medieval culture reached for, that God had judged between the two sides and found France wanting, was not comforting. It implied that something was fundamentally wrong, not merely with French tactics or French leadership, but with France itself, with its legitimacy, with its worthiness to survive as a kingdom. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 seemed to confirm the worst. Signed under conditions of a French political collapse and the mental incapacity of the French King Charles VI, it disinherited the French Crown Prince, the Dauphin Charles, and recognized Henry V of England as heir to the French throne. When Henry V and Charles VI both died in 1422 within weeks of each other, an infant English king, Henry VI, was proclaimed King of France, and English and Burgundian forces controlled Paris and much of the north of the country. The Dauphin Charles held out in the south and center of France, maintaining a court at Chinon that his enemies mocked as a rum kingdom without credibility or military force. He was a diffident, indecisive young man, psychologically damaged by a childhood spent in a court, consumed by factional violence and by the public question, raised by his own mother, of whether he was actually the legitimate son of the Mad King. He controlled territory, but he lacked the will, the resources, and perhaps the belief in his own legitimacy that would have been needed to mount a kind of military campaign that could reverse the tide. Into this situation, in the winter of 1429, came Jeanne d'Arc. She was approximately 17 years old. She came from Domremy, a small village in the borderlands of Lorraine, a region that had experienced the war's violence directly and whose inhabitants had strong reasons to fear continued English and Burgundian dominance. She had no military training, no noble lineage, no political connections, and no obvious qualification for the role she was about to claim. What she had was an absolute unshakable conviction that she had been called by God, specifically by the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, to drive the English from France and see the Dauphin crowned as the rightful king at Reims. The historical question of what was actually happening in Jeanne's inner life is one that cannot be resolved from the distance of 6 centuries. What can be said with confidence is that her conviction was genuine, not performed, not calculated, not the instrument of some political faction that was using her as a figurehead. The political faction certainly tried to use her once she had demonstrated her utility. The surviving testimony from the people who knew her and fought alongside her describes someone whose certainty was absolute, and whose effect on the people around her was, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. Getting access to the Dauphin required persuading a series of increasingly senior military and political figures that she was not a fraud, not a witch, not a madwoman, and not a security risk. She did this somehow through a combination of personal force, specific predictions that proved accurate, and a theological examination by church authorities at Poitiers, who concluded, after weeks of questioning, that there was nothing heretical or diabolical about her claims. In March 1429, she met Charles at Chinon. What passed between them in their first private meeting was never fully disclosed, but its effect on Charles was visible and immediate. He authorized her to accompany the army being assembled to relieve the siege of Orléans. Orléans was the critical point. The city on the Loire had been under English siege since October 1428, and its fall would open the road to the south, threatening the remaining French-held territory with a depth of English penetration that would have made continued resistance almost impossible. The city's defenders were exhausted, their supplies were running low, and the relief attempts mounted before Jeanne's arrival had failed. Military logic suggested that Orléans would fall. What happened instead has been analyzed by military historians for centuries, without producing a fully satisfying explanation in purely tactical terms. Jeanne did not transform the French army's fighting ability through tactical innovation. She did not bring overwhelming reinforcements or superior weapons. What she brought was something that is both harder to quantify and, in the circumstances, more important. She changed what the French soldiers believed was possible. This is not a mystical claim. It is a psychological one. Armies fight better when they believe they can win. They make better decisions. They hold positions longer. They recover from setbacks more quickly. They take the risks that create opportunities. An army that believes God is on its side, and that the extraordinary young woman riding at its front is the proof of that divine favor, fights differently than an army that believes it is slowly losing a war it cannot win. The difference in performance is real, measurable in outcomes, even if its source is entirely internal. The siege of Orléans was lifted in May 1429, after 9 days of fighting in which Jeanne participated directly, was wounded by an arrow to the shoulder, and continued fighting. The English withdrew. The road to Reims was opened. In July 1429, Charles was crowned King of France in the cathedral at Reims, the traditional coronation site whose symbolic importance to French royal legitimacy was immense, with Jeanne standing beside him holding her banner. The coronation mattered beyond its ceremonial significance. It answered, in the most powerful symbolic register available to medieval culture, the question that the Treaty of Troyes had raised. Charles VII was not a rump king, a pretender, a disinherited bastard holding out in the provinces. He was the anointed king of France, crowned in the proper place by the proper ritual, legitimized by God and demonstrated by victory. Jeanne was captured by Burgundian forces in May 1430, sold to the English, tried by an ecclesiastical court on charges of heresy and wearing men's clothing, and burned at the stake in Rouen in May 1431. She was 19 years old. The English and their allies believed that destroying her would reverse what she had set in motion. They were wrong. The momentum she had created, military, psychological, symbolic, outlasted her. The belief she had restored in French soldiers and French subjects, the legitimacy she had secured for Charles VII, the demonstration she had provided that the English were not invincible. None of that died with her in the fire. France had remembered what winning felt like, and it would not forget again. Victories, even transformative ones, do not end wars by themselves. Jeanne d'Arc had restored French momentum, secured the coronation of Charles VII, and demonstrated with brutal clarity that the English military position in France was more fragile than a decade of dominance had made it appear. But the English were still in France. They still held Paris. They still controlled Normandy and the large portions of the north. Their Burgundian allies, the powerful duchy, whose support had been essential to English strategic success since the assassination of Duke John the Fearless in 1419, remained for the time being committed to the Anglo-French settlement that the Treaty of Troyes had established. The war that Jeanne had reinvigorated was not over. It had entered a new phase, and that phase would last another 2 decades, grinding through sieges and skirmishes and diplomatic maneuvers and occasional pitched battles before the conflict finally reached its exhausted conclusion. The transformation of those 2 decades was not primarily military, though military events mattered. It was institutional, a slow, difficult, and often painful reorganization of the French state that gave Charles VII the administrative and financial foundations, without which no amount of battlefield success could be sustained. The fundamental problem that France had faced throughout the war was structural. The English crown, fighting on foreign soil, had certain advantages that partially offset the disadvantages of the distance and supply. A more coherent command structure, a more disciplined army, and, critically, a more reliable method of financing military operations through parliamentary taxation. The French crown, by contrast, had relied on a system of feudal obligation and ad hoc taxation that was inefficient, inconsistent, and deeply resented by the nobility and commoners alike who were required to fund it. When the system worked, France's greater size and wealth gave it potential military resources that England could not match. When it broke down, as it did repeatedly during the crisis decades of the early 15th century, France could not effectively deploy the advantages it theoretically possessed. Charles VII, with advisors who understood this structural problem, spent the years following the coronation building something new, a more centralized, more professionally administered royal state with the capacity to raise and sustain a standing army. The Ordnance Companies established in 1445 were the most visible expression of this effort. Permanent cavalry units, paid directly by the crown on a regular basis, their captains appointed by the king rather than by a feudal obligation, their loyalty to the royal institution rather than to individual lords. This was not a revolutionary idea in the abstract. Standing armies had existed in antiquity and had been proposed by political theorists throughout the medieval period. But its practical implementation in France in the 1440s represented a genuine departure from the military organization that had characterized the first century of the war. The complementary reform was artillery. Here, France developed an advantage that would prove decisive in the war's final phase. The brothers Jean and Gaspard Bureau, serving as master gunners in the royal service, oversaw the development and deployment of a train of artillery, mobile cannon capable of being moved with an army in the field and brought to bear on fortifications. That was, by the late 1440s, the most effective in Europe. Medieval castles and town walls that had been designed to resist scaling ladders and battering rams had no adequate defense against heavy artillery. The fortifications that had made English-held positions in Normandy and Aquitaine expensive to assault directly became, under artillery bombardment, untenable. The reconquest of Normandy, completed in 1450, demonstrated what the reformed French military could do. English garrisons that might have held out for months against traditional siege methods fell within days or weeks under artillery bombardment. The Battle of Formigny in April 1450, one of the few large conventional engagements of the war's final phase, ended with the destruction of an English relieving army and effectively sealed the fate of English Normandy, the province that England had controlled since Henry V's conquest, the province that had been the geographic and strategic heart of the English position in northern France, was gone within a single campaign season. Aquitaine fell with similar speed. The duchy that English kings had held since the 12th century, whose wine trade with England had created deep commercial connections between the two countries, whose population had developed complex and ambivalent loyalties over generations of English rule, was reconquered in 1451. An English attempt to reverse this, mounted in 1452 and 1453 under the command of the aged but still formidable John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, who had been one of the most effective English commanders of the war's middle decades, ended at the Battle of Castillon in July 1453, where French artillery destroyed the English force and Talbot himself was killed. Castillon was the last major engagement of the 100 Years' War. It was not formally recognized as such at the time. No peace treaty was signed in 1453, and the English crown did not officially renounce its claim to the French throne for decades afterward. But the practical reality was unmistakable. After Castillon, England held only Calais of all the vast French territories it had controlled at the height of its power. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. What a century of conflict had cost is almost impossible to fully calculate. The human toll was staggering. Military casualties from battle, siege, and the endemic low-level violence of an occupied country were enormous, but they were dwarfed by the indirect deaths from famine produced by the systematic destruction of agricultural land, from disease that followed armies and flourished among malnourished populations, from the social breakdown that accompanied decades of interrupted harvests, disrupted trade, and the constant movement of armed men through civilian communities. Certain regions of France, Normandy, the Ile-de-France, the areas along the Loire Valley that had seen the heaviest fighting, lost population on a scale comparable to the Black Death. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned. Agricultural land reverted to scrub and forest. The economic cost compounded the human one. The wool and wine trades that had connected England and France in a web of mutual commercial dependence were disrupted for generations. The Italian banking houses that had financed both sides of the conflict extracted their profits, but the underlying productive economies of both kingdoms were significantly weakened. England, in particular, emerged from the war with financial problems that contributed directly to the internal political instability of the following decades. The dynastic conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, which consumed English political energy for the remainder of the 15th century, and was, in a meaningful sense, one of the long-term consequences of the resources exhausted in France. France emerged stronger in the paradoxical way that extreme stress sometimes produces institutional strength. The centralized royal state that Charles VII had built to win the war outlasted the war itself. The standing army, the reformed taxation system, the more professional royal administration. These were not dismantled when the fighting ended. They became the foundation of the French monarchy's growing power in the late 15th and 16th centuries. The administrative skeleton of a state that will become, in the following 2 centuries, the dominant power in European politics. The identity of France was also transformed in ways that the war's originators could not have anticipated. A conflict that had begun as a dynastic dispute between ruling houses, a quarrel about which king had the better genealogical claim to a throne, had over the course of a century generated something that had not fully existed at its beginning, a French national consciousness. The experience of foreign occupation, of resistance, of shared suffering and eventual collective victory had bound together communities that previously identified primarily with their local lord, their province, their town. Jeanne d'Arc, who came from a borderland village and died in a Norman city and had no particular connection to the Parisian nobility who dominated French political culture, had become a national symbol precisely because her story transcended regional and class boundaries in a way that purely aristocratic narratives could not. The war had not been fought for the French nation. The concept would have been largely unfamiliar to most of the people who fought it. But the French nation was, in important ways, one of the things the war produced. This is one of history's recurring ironies, that the consequences of great conflicts routinely exceed and often contradict the intentions of those who begin them. The English kings who claimed the French throne wanted territory, revenue, and dynastic glory. What they produced, over a century of trying and ultimately failing, was a stronger, more centralized, more self-conscious France than had existed when the first English soldier set foot on French soil in 1337. Philip VI could not have imagined it. Edward III could not have imagined it. Neither could the peasants of Domremy, watching soldiers pass through their village. But history rarely produces what anyone imagined. It produces what the long accumulation of decisions, sacrifices, accidents, and consequences eventually compels. And what 100 years of war compelled, in the end, was not the triumph of one dynasty over another. It was the birth of something larger than either.